Montecito didn't scream, it didn't explode, it didn't stage a dramatic eviction with flashing cameras or security dragging suitcases down the driveway. It did something far worse. It went cold, silent, distant. And in Montecito, silence is not peace, it's rejection. Because when a community built on billionaires, royalty, and A-list invisibility decides you no longer belong, they don't fight you, they erase you. And that's exactly the chilling message Meghan Markle allegedly faced when she returned to the very place that was supposed to be her forever sanctuary. This was supposed to be her kingdom, her California crown, her untouchable fortress far away from palace whispers and royal suffocation. Montecito wasn't just a house, it was a symbol, proof that she had escaped the monarchy and won. Palm trees replacing palace walls, ocean air replacing royal protocol, freedom replacing obligation. She had finally arrived somewhere she controlled. But now, insiders whisper that the same neighborhood that once tolerated her presence had quietly shifted. No confrontations, no public humiliation, just something colder than anger, indifference. The kind of indifference that suffocates you slowly because it tells you that your presence no longer matters. And when Meghan reportedly returned to retrieve personal belongings, she wasn't met with warmth. She wasn't met with curiosity. She wasn't even met with resistance. She was met with emotional distance so thick it might as well have been a locked gate. Insiders described it as the welcome mat disappearing overnight, not rolled up dramatically, just gone. No invitation, no reassurance, just the quiet realization that the door had closed. Montecito is not Hollywood. It doesn't thrive on chaos, it survives on control. Oprah lives there. Billionaires live there. People with more money than noise. People who mastered the art of disappearing despite being famous. And the unspoken rule is simple. Don't bring attention that threatens the illusion. Don't turn privacy into spectacle. Don't let the outside world see inside. But according to whispers circulating behind perfectly trimmed hedges and guarded gates, the Sussex presence allegedly disrupted that balance. Security convoys, cameras, attention, the constant gravitational pull of controversy. The neighborhood didn't explode. It absorbed it until it didn't anymore. Because Montecito doesn't tolerate chaos forever. It tolerates it temporarily, politely, quietly, until patience expires. And patience, insiders claim, had expired. At first, the excitement was undeniable. A real prince, a duchess, global headlines moving into their quiet coastal paradise. It was intriguing, it was glamorous, it was historic. But intrigue has an expiration date. Glamour fades when it brings disruption, and history becomes inconvenient when it refuses to stay quiet. Neighbors allegedly began noticing the changes. Fewer friendly gestures, less curiosity, less enthusiasm. What once felt like fascination turned into fatigue. And fatigue in elite circles is a death sentence because elite communities don't exile you publicly. They exile you emotionally. And while the emotional freeze was spreading outside, something even more dangerous was happening inside Meghan's world. The slow unraveling of the empire she had worked so aggressively to build. There was a time when money flowed like oxygen. Netflix deals, Spotify deals, endless promises of global media dominance. Every announcement sounded like confirmation that she had successfully reinvented herself as a global power player beyond the royal machine. Private jets weren't indulgences, they were routine. Luxury wasn't optional, it was expected. She had escaped the crown and built something that looked even bigger. But power built on perception is fragile, and perception was shifting. Spotify disappeared first, quietly, without dramatic explanation. Just gone. Netflix momentum slowed. Fashion houses stopped calling as often. Invitations became less frequent. The phone didn't ring the same way. And suddenly, maintaining the Montecito lifestyle wasn't just about status, it was about survival. Because Montecito isn't just expensive, it's suffocatingly expensive. Property taxes alone can bleed millions over time. Add security, add staff, add the illusion of permanent luxury. The burn rate doesn't slow down, it accelerates. And insiders began noticing subtle changes. Less staff visible, fewer high-profile visitors arriving, less movement behind the gates. The kind of small details that mean nothing to outsiders but everything to those watching closely. Because Montecito residents are experts at observation. They don't gossip loudly, they analyze quietly, and they had started to notice. Meanwhile, Meghan's reputation outside the gates wasn't stabilizing, it was fracturing. Rumors of awkward encounters at fashion events, whispers about doors closing in elite European circles, allegations that once welcoming industry figures were becoming hesitant. Each headline wasn't fatal alone, but together they formed something dangerous, a narrative shift. And narratives once formed are brutally difficult to reverse because the truth about celebrity power is simple. It only exists as long as people believe in it, and belief was weakening. Inside, Meghan allegedly wasn't taking the shift quietly. Insiders claim she felt misunderstood, targeted, frustrated that criticism followed her regardless of her actions. From her perspective, she hadn't failed. She had been sabotaged, misrepresented, twisted by forces she couldn't control. She reportedly felt like she was constantly defending herself against an invisible opponent, a narrative machine she couldn't shut off. And the idea that even Montecito, her sanctuary, was emotionally pulling away felt like betrayal layered on top of exhaustion, because Montecito wasn't supposed to abandon her. Montecito was supposed to protect her. But protection in elite worlds is conditional, and conditions had changed. Harry, meanwhile, was reportedly undergoing his own internal collapse. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, slowly. The kind of internal conflict that doesn't show on camera but leaks through behavior. Friends allegedly described him as nostalgic, not necessarily for royal life itself, but for clarity, for certainty, for structure. Because before California, he knew who he was. His role was defined. His purpose was permanent. But in Montecito, identity became fluid, negotiated, dependent on contracts, projects, and public approval. And public approval was unpredictable. There were whispers he had privately admitted the emotional exhaustion, that every week felt less like progress and more like damage control, less like building something meaningful and more like constantly reacting to controversy. Freedom had been the dream, but freedom without stability can feel like floating without gravity. And gravity, once lost, is difficult to regain. And as Montecito's emotional distance grew colder, the symbolism became impossible to ignore. Because Montecito wasn't just a place, it was the last illusion of permanence. And now even that illusion was cracking. The silence didn't just linger outside the gates, it crept inside. It settled into the walls. It filled the empty spaces between conversations. Because the most terrifying moment in any rise isn't the fall itself, it's the realization that the world is no longer watching the way it used to. And insiders whisper that Meghan had started to feel it. That shift, that unbearable transition from fascination to fatigue. There was a time when her name alone could bend headlines, when every move triggered global analysis. When brands didn't hesitate, they chased her. They fought for proximity to her influence. She wasn't just relevant, she was unavoidable. But now, something darker had replaced that magnetic pull. Hesitation, doubt, distance. And nothing terrifies a public figure more than becoming optional. Because irrelevance doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives politely, quietly, with fewer invitations, shorter guest lists, longer silences between opportunities. Behind closed doors, insiders claim Meghan wasn't calm about it. She wasn't indifferent. She was furious. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, she remained composed, controlled, unbothered. But privately, frustration reportedly bled into conversations. Because from her perspective, she had done everything right. She had escaped the suffocating system. She had built her own identity. She had leveraged her story into global influence. And yet, somehow, the narrative refused to stabilize. She allegedly couldn't understand why acceptance remained conditional, why doors opened but never fully stayed open, why admiration always came with expiration dates. And the deeper fear wasn't rejection itself. It was permanence, the possibility that this wasn't temporary, that this wasn't just a phase, that this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to correct itself, that this was the new reality. Because reinvention works best when the audience still believes in your evolution, but belief, once fractured, doesn't repair easily. Meanwhile, Harry was drifting deeper into emotional isolation, not physically, emotionally. Insiders described a man caught between two worlds, one he left behind and one that never fully embraced him. He had traded certainty for autonomy, structure for freedom, but freedom came with instability he had never experienced before. Because inside the royal institution, he had been permanent, untouchable, defined. Outside it, everything was conditional, temporary, negotiable. And that psychological shift doesn't just affect status, it affects identity. Friends reportedly noticed subtle changes, longer silences, less enthusiasm, moments where he seemed mentally distant even when physically present, because the life he had chosen wasn't delivering the emotional clarity he had imagined. It wasn't the clean break from pressure. It was a different kind of pressure, one without centuries of tradition supporting it, one built entirely on public approval and private deals. And public approval is unpredictable. Every headline carried weight. Every rumor carried consequences. Every failure echoed louder because there was no institutional shield left to absorb the impact. He wasn't just protecting his family anymore, he was protecting their survival. And survival in Montecito wasn't just about money. It was about perception. Because Montecito residents don't tolerate instability. They tolerate strength, confidence, permanence. And insiders claim the subtle shift in how neighbors interacted with them was impossible to ignore. Less warmth, less casual friendliness, less engagement, not hostile, just distant. Distance is how elite communities signal rejection without confrontation. And Meghan felt it. Because rejection doesn't need words. It lives in absence. There were reportedly moments where she questioned everything. Not publicly. Never publicly. But privately. Moments where the emotional cost of independence collided with the unpredictable reality of maintaining it. Because leaving the monarchy wasn't just an escape. It was a gamble. And gambles only feel empowering while they're winning. But when momentum slows, empowerment turns into vulnerability. And vulnerability is terrifying when your entire identity has been rebuilt around strength. She wasn't just fighting critics anymore. She was fighting erosion. Because erosion doesn't destroy you instantly. It weakens you slowly. Piece by piece. Opportunity by opportunity. Invitation by invitation. Until one day, you realize the world that once chased you has moved on without announcing it. And Montecito, the place that symbolized her victory, was now quietly reflecting that shift. The neighbors hadn't changed dramatically. They hadn't turned hostile. They hadn't launched attacks. They had simply recalibrated their emotional investment. Because Montecito isn't driven by drama, it's driven by equilibrium. And anything that threatens equilibrium eventually gets pushed to the edges. Not through confrontation, through exclusion. And insiders claim Meghan recognized that pattern. That the warmth she once relied on had cooled. That the curiosity had evaporated. That the invisible social safety net she assumed existed was never guaranteed. Because Montecito doesn't owe anyone permanence, not even royalty. And the most brutal realization wasn't financial. It wasn't professional, it was psychological. The understanding that there might not be another reinvention waiting. That the cycle of transformation, actress, duchess, activist, producer, cultural disruptor had limits. That each reinvention required belief. And belief requires emotional investment from the audience. And emotional investment had thinned. There were whispers about relocation, new beginnings, new environments. Australia surfaced in conversations. Canada resurfaced as a nostalgic possibility, but insiders suggested even those options carried uncertainty because relocation doesn't erase perception. It follows you quietly, persistently. And philanthropy, while noble, doesn't restore celebrity dominance. Media projects could return, but media requires narrative leverage, and narrative leverage requires public curiosity. Without fresh revelations, without dramatic pivots, without something emotionally explosive to capture attention, momentum remains stagnant. And stagnation is fatal in celebrity ecosystems because celebrity doesn't survive on history. It survives on relevance, and relevance must be constantly fed. Inside their private world, the pressure reportedly became suffocating. Not explosive arguments, not dramatic breakdowns, just quiet tension. The kind that grows when two people realize the dream they built together isn't evolving the way they imagined. Harry had sacrificed his birthright for autonomy. Meghan had sacrificed stability for independence. Both had gambled everything. And Montecito had been the reward. But now Montecito itself felt uncertain, not physically, symbolically, because the physical gates were still there. The house still stood. The ocean still moved, but the emotional foundation had shifted, and emotional shifts are irreversible. The most terrifying part wasn't losing Montecito itself. It was losing what Montecito represented: safety, victory, finality. Because without Montecito as their emotional anchor, everything else felt temporary, fragile, negotiable. And insiders claim Meghan understood that more clearly than anyone, that the fight ahead wasn't just about rebuilding income. It wasn't just about restoring influence. It was about reclaiming narrative dominance. Because whoever controls the narrative controls survival. And right now, the narrative wasn't hers. It belonged to whispers. It belonged to speculation. It belonged to silence. And silence in elite circles is the loudest rejection of all.